Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to part 2 of the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. Last week we watched as little Edgar, born in Boston to actors, became an orphan after watching his mother die of tuberculosis, was then made the foster son of John and Franny Allan in Richmond, Virginia, then attended boarding school in England, Edgar excelling at Greek and Latin and displaying an amazing talent at writing poetry from a very young age. He went on to the University of Virginia, where he was a promising and gifted student, but was forced to drop out of the college because of financial reasons and gambling debts, his wealthy foster father refusing to aid him. After a stint in the army and the death of his beloved foster mother Fanny, Poe reconciled with his foster father John, and it was agreed Edgar would then attend the elite West Point Military Academy, where our story picks back up.
Let's begin. Chapter 1. Goth Animal House. On June 20th, 1830, wily and rascally, obsessively morbid poet Eddie Poe arrived at the notoriously strict West Point Military Academy, and the wacky hijinks would soon begin. After spending the summer in a tent with 3 other cadets, in September, Eddie moved into 28 South Barracks for the start of classes. The students were given 304 regulations to follow, including no drinking, no gambling, no novels or plays, no card playing, no tobacco, no cooking in the rooms, no musical instruments, no games of chess or backgammon. You couldn't even bathe in the river.
There was a long tradition of cadets trying to break as many of these rules as possible during their stay at the academy, and Edgar Poe set to this with gusto.
In many ways, the military academy was the polar opposite of the University of Virginia, where free thinking and self-governance were encouraged, and reading a novel was the least of anyone's worries.
At 21 years old, Edgar Poe was older than most of the cadets at West Point. He was also a published poet with 2 books, which lent him a further air of prestige and sophistication. And Edgar loved to regale the other cadets with his life's adventures, most of which were made up whole cloth.
Edgar started his own little underground magazine of sorts, with lines of verse that poked fun at their instructors, bawdy limericks, as well as humorous opinion pieces about local news. As one of his roommates would later say,
very early in his brief career at the Point, he established a high reputation for genius, and poems and squibs of local interest were daily issued from room number 28 and went the round of the classes. He would write some of the most forcible and vicious doggerel, have me copy it with my left hand in order that it might be disguised, and post it around the building.
They would sneak out to the tavern down the road, run by one Benny Havens, who loved to supply forbidden liquor to the cadets and prattle on to them as his wife brought out roasted turkey and buckwheat cakes.
And they'd make covert alcohol runs, which they called blockade runs, one cadet keeping a lookout while the other ran to the tavern to procure a bottle, which they'd stash in their room. Edgar's room, number 28, quickly became known as the party room, where one could go to get a shot of the forbidden liquor.
As Edgar's roommate Gibson said, quote, "Many a thirsty soul with not enough of pluck to run the blockade himself would steal into our room between tattoo and taps to try the merits of the last importation."
One dark and rainy night in the end of November, they were all lamenting the lack of brandy and decided to make a blockade run. They drew straws to see who would replenish the stock, and Gibson drew the short straw.
So, as Edgar stood lookout, Gibson ran the gauntlet to the tavern, old Benny giving him a bottle of brandy and goose, chopping the head off right there for him.
Gibson, carrying the decapitated goose over his shoulder through the rain, was covered in blood by the time he got back, and Edgar, seeing him in such a state, devised a wacky prank.
Edgar took the bottle and went back to the room, where some cadets were hanging out, hoping to get a few drinks. Edgar went to his desk and began studying his French, acting as if nothing was amiss. They're all sitting there in candlelight when Gibson came staggering through the door, covered in blood, exclaiming, "I've done it! I've done it!"
Edgar leapt up, shouting, "My God! What has happened?"
"I killed him! Killed the night watchman! Slit his throat, then cut his head clean off! Decapitated him! He'll never stop me on the road again!"
"Oh, nonsense," Edgar exclaimed. "You're only playing one of your tricks on us."
"You don't believe me? I have his head right here!" And with that, Gibson threw the goose across the room at the candle, plunging them all into darkness.
One of the visitors leapt right out the window and went tearing away, while another sat curled in the corner, his, quote, face a blank picture of horror.
But while things were fun and games at West Point, forces were conspiring against Edgar.
His relationship with his foster father, John Allan, was beginning to unravel again, the rich old man accusing him of taking books that weren't his. He's one of the wealthiest men in all of Virginia, and he's going to scorn his poet godson books. What a jerk. And did we mention he'd also been cheating on Franny while she was alive and had sired several illegitimate children?
And again, his foster father wasn't supplying Edgar with enough money to survive at the academy, to buy books and food, trying to make Edgar learn to rely on himself, although John himself had inherited a fortune. Edgar couldn't even afford to buy soap.
And then John remarried, a bride 20 years younger than him from a very wealthy family, further cementing his vast fortune. And though the wedding was held there in New York, not far from West Point, Edgar was not invited.
And just months before the wedding, one of John Allan's mistresses had borne him illegitimate twin sons.
And then the shit really hit the fan. When Edgar had been discharged from the army, he'd had to find a replacement soldier to take his place. And a man named Graves had agreed to do it for $75. So Edgar gave him $25, assuring him that his foster father, one of the richest men in all of Virginia, would pay the rest. Of course, John Allan was incredibly stingy and thought the arrangement a bad deal, and was furious that Edgar had even agreed to it. And apparently when Graves began to pester Edgar for the $50 he owed him, Edgar told Graves that his foster father wasn't sober very often, making it hard to get the money. When word of this accusation of drunkenness inevitably got back to John, he was irate and completely cut Edgar off, writing to him that he never wanted to hear from him again.
But Poe wrote back, saying,
I suppose, although you desire no further communication with yourself on my part, that your restriction does not extend to my answering your final letter. Did I, when an infant, solicit your charity and protection? Or was it of your own free will that you volunteered your services in my behalf? Fanny loved me as her own child, and after her death, you promised me to forgive all. But you soon forgot your promise. You sent me to West Point like a beggar. The difficulties are threatening me as before at Charlottesville, and I must resign.
John responded by telling friends, quote, I do not think the boy has one good quality. I cannot believe a word he writes.
So, seeing himself as having no choice, having no funds to continue with his education, Edgar simply stopped going to classes and reporting for duty, letting a general court-martial go into effect, doing nothing to stop it, offering no defense, and remaining quiet when questioned.
Expelled from West Point, Edgar then headed off for New York City.
And here he set to publishing his third book of poetry.
He found funds for the project with his friends in West Point. They'd loved the wacky writings he'd done there, the hilarious poetry making fun of their teachers, the weird takes on local events, the bawdy verses. Over 100 of his classmates contributed funds to underwrite his third book of poetry, collecting over $150.
And the book came out in May of 1831, simply titled Poems by Edgar A. Poe, in an edition of 500 copies.
But his friends at West Point were in for a disappointment. It wasn't military spoofs or goofy limericks making fun of captains and lieutenants. Instead, it was a grim and mournful look at lost youth and death, with verses like,
And so being young, dipped in folly, I fell in love with melancholy, and used to throw my earthly rest and quiet all away in jest. I could not love except where death was mingling his with beauty's breath.
One cadet stated, quote, This book is a damn cheat, end quote. Though in time it would come to be regarded as a masterwork of a bold young poet.
Chapter 2, Baltimore. Always on the move, never staying long enough anywhere to gather cobwebs on his shoes, Poe thought about hopping a freighter to Europe and joining the Polish army in battle against Russia. But when France abandoned Poland as an ally, he gave up on this Byron-esque dream.
So he headed south to Baltimore, to his grandmother's house, where his Aunt Maria was living with her 8-year-old daughter Virginia and his beloved brother Henry.
It was not happy times. The family were barely scraping by on the pension of Poe's grandmother, who is now paralytic and bedridden. Aunt Maria did some seamstress work when she could, and Henry had fallen deep into alcoholism, the dreaded family curse.
Sadly, it seems tragedy and death followed poor Edgar wherever he went. For on August 1st, 1831, his brother Henry died of tuberculosis and alcoholism. the same deadly combination that had killed their father. Henry was only 24 years old, the same age their mother had been when the consumption had ravished her as well.
Henry had been more than just a brother, also a writer, a poet. He was a literary comrade. Edgar and Henry would collaborate, share stories, and use each other as springboards to bounce ideas off of, even basing stories off of their own adventures. The death of Henry was a huge blow to Edgar.
Henry was buried in the family plot in the churchyard of the First Presbyterian Church, the forlorn piece of ground that would one day hold Edgar, as well as Virginia.
Poe then had a brief romance with a 17-year-old neighbor girl named Mary Starr.
So much of Edgar Allan Poe is a mystery, we don't even know what color his eyes were. Some say hazel, some say gray, some say light blue, others even violet. But the recollections of Mary Starr really help us see the young poet as he was in those wild days there in Baltimore.
Mary described a passionate writer who dressed entirely in black, with a black frock coat and black cravat, who scoffed at all things sacred and would never go to a church. When Edgar saw Mary sitting on the stoop of her row home, he immediately leapt over the balustrades separating them and sat down next to her, telling her she had the most beautiful hair he had ever seen, the hair that poets raved of, auburn with frizzled puffs on the side. Mary says,
"He was handsome, but intellectually so, not a pretty man. He had dark, almost black hair, which he wore long and brushed back in student style. It was as fine as silk. The expression about his mouth was beautiful. He was pale. He had a sad, melancholy look. He had the power to draw anyone to him. He was very fascinating, and any young girl would have fallen in love with him. When he looked at you, it seemed as if he could read your very thought. His voice was pleasant and musical."
Mary says that though the Poe family were very poor, they were fastidious, very neat, and extremely clean.
For over a year, Edgar visited Mary every single night, courting her, and even spoke of marriage, which was opposed by her family because of Edgar's inability to support himself.
But it all came to an end, as it often did for Poe, with alcohol. Mary says during the year he courted her, he never drank a drop. But then, when some old friends from West Point came to town and took him to Barnum's Hotel, he started drinking champagne with them.
Edgar then drunkenly stumbled to Mary's house, and the two fell into an argument about his inebriated state. And when Mary ran up into her room, her mother had to physically block Edgar from chasing after her. After the scandalous scene, the courtship was over.
Chapter 3: The Short Story Writer.
Edgar Poe always considered himself a poet above all else. But when a Philadelphia publication called the Saturday Courier announced it was accepting entries for a contest in the promotion of the cause of literature, and that the winning entry would be named the Best American Tale, and the author awarded $100, Edgar decided to try his hand at short story writing.
Edgar submitted 5 stories to the contest. Metzengerstein, a Gothic horror tale in the German tradition, perhaps even a bit of a spoof on that tradition. The Duc de la Omelette, a comic tale about an aristocrat who engages with the devil in a game of cards, as well as A Tale of Jerusalem, A Decided Loss, and The Bargain Lost.
Edgar did not win the contest, but the judges stated his stories were distinguished by great merit, and did end up publishing all 5 of the stories throughout the year 1832.
The publishing of Poe's first short stories, in particular Metzengerstein, is a milestone in American literature and the history of Gothic horror.
Gothic horror had already established itself in Europe with novels such as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto in 1764, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, and in particular, Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk in 1796. Those are like all 3 personal faves of mine. And in America, Washington Irving's scary and supernatural tales like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow were very popular.
And with Metzengerstein, Poe firmly established himself as part of this lineage and found his creepy short stories were much more popular than his poems.
And he had finally found the family and mother figure he'd been searching for his whole life. His Aunt Maria Clem became an anchor of encouragement and love for the restless young writer, providing all the emotional support the troubled poet needed, a kind and comforting presence.
But the little family was plagued with financial hardship. While Edgar began to churn out classic horror short stories still read today, he was given little compensation for them.
He pursued work as an editorial assistant and a teacher, but ended up a kiln worker in a brickyard, becoming so desperate he wrote to his stepfather, John Allan.
It has been more than 3 years since you have spoken to me. I am perishing, absolutely perishing for want of aid. And yet I am not idle, nor addicted to any vice. Save me from destruction.
Allan ignored his pleas, saying, quote, "He is an ingrate, destitute of honor and principle. His talents are of an order that can never prove a comfort to their possessor."
But then a local publication, the Baltimore Saturday Visitor, announced a contest to encourage literature, offering a $50 prize for the best short story and $25 for the best poem.
Poe sent them 1 poem, The Colosseum, and 5 short stories grouped together under the heading The Tales of the Folio Club, including the classic MS Found in a Bottle.
The judges were blown away, staggered, exclaiming, "The singular force and beauty left us no ground for doubt. We were wholly unprepared for what he sent. His stories were so far, so very far superior to anything before us that we had no difficulty in awarding the first prize to the author. Our only difficulty was in selecting from the rich contents of the volume. These tales are eminently distinguished by a wild, vigorous, and poetical imagination, a rich style, a fertile invention, and varied and curious learning. We took MS Found in a Bottle, very impressed with its literary allusions to both Robinson Crusoe and the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner."
For Edgar, it was the confirmation of his talents that he so desperately needed. Poe visited with one of the judges, John Pendleton Kennedy, who was friends with many writers, including Washington Irving, Charles Dickens, and William Thackeray.
John Kennedy describes Edgar Allan Poe like a goth beatnik, which, in many ways, he really was, saying,
"He was dressed entirely in black, and his frock coat was buttoned to the throat. Not a particle of white was visible. Coat, hat, boots, and gloves had very evidently seen their best days. On most men, his clothes would have looked shabby and seedy, but there was something about this man that prevented one from criticizing his garments.
But Edgar Allan Poe, being Edgar Allan Poe, he couldn't just enjoy this great victory. When he discovered that he'd only gotten second place in the poetry category, and that first place had gone to the new editor of the magazine, one John Hill Hewitt, who had submitted and won the award under a pseudonym, Edgar accosted the man on the street, accusing him of using his position of editor to cheat him out of the poetry prize.
Hewitt claims he answered the accusation with a, quote, blow which staggered him, for I was physically his superior, end quote.
But Poe was ready to brawl and scrambled up, fists raised, and friends had to pull the two prize winners apart.
Years later, Edgar would later come to him humbly asking that bygones be bygones.
The Saturday Review offered to publish the stories all together as a book, but Edgar, feeling emboldened, turned down their offer, instead searching out more renowned publisher, sending them to Philadelphia's Carey and Leah. Henry C. Carey sat on the manuscript for years before finally rejecting it. Life of a fucking writer, man.
As Poe, oh my god, dude, my keyboard is haunted. As Poe, where did it just go? As Poe was winning contests and finding acclaim in Baltimore, in Richmond, his foster father, John Allan, was growing increasingly sick. Edgar, grieving despite the cruel man's indifference toward him, supposedly went to see him on his deathbed.
Greeted at the door by John's new wife, who didn't recognize Edgar and refused to let him into the house, the mansion that Poe had once called home, Edgar pushed her aside and stormed up the steps to his foster father's bedroom, only to have the old merchant wave a cane at him and threaten to strike him if he came near, telling him to get out of the house.
But many historians doubt this event took place, as there's no real record of it, just part of the gossip and lore surrounding Poe. But there is no doubting that on March 27th, John Allan died. He was 54 years old and was buried in Shaku Hill Cemetery.
John Allan left an immense fortune behind, including 8 houses, stocks and banks and railroads, massive land holdings, and a lumber yard. And this vast fortune was left mostly to his widow and the 3 children they'd had together, as well as to the illegitimate children John had sired over the years with his mistress.
But his foster son, Edgar Allan Poe, whom he'd baptized with his own name and raised as his own, didn't get a single cent, and wasn't even mentioned in the will.
Edgar, who had long dreamed of returning to Richmond to live as a poet aristocrat, mingling with high society and charming them with his cutting wit at fancy dinner parties, was crushed by being left out of the will.
Desperate for money, struggling, working as a kiln operator for a brick manufacturer, he appealed to the literary judge John Kennedy, who was so taken with his work, asking if he could get him a job teaching English.
Kennedy invited Poe to his home for dinner to discuss the matter. Poe told him he was unable to attend the dinner for the most humiliating of reasons. He had no proper clothes to wear. All of his clothing had become tattered beyond repair.
Kennedy was heavy-hearted to see such a great literary talent in what he says was a state of starvation, stating, "I gave him clothing, free access to my table, and the use of a horse for exercise whenever he chose. In fact, brought him up from the very verge of despair.
And Kennedy even went out of his way to see that dear Aunt Clem and Cousin Virginia were provided with food.
Kennedy referred Edgar to Thomas Willis White, a Richmond printer who had founded the Southern Literary Messenger in August of 1834.
Poe began sending poetry, book reviews, and short stories to the Southern Literary Messenger, including the lurid shocker, Berenice, where a beautiful yet ailing bride is buried alive, and her grave is desecrated by the haunted narrator who uses dental tools to rip 30 of the corpse's teeth free.
This was some wild shit for 1834. Very transgressive, pushing the boundaries of Gothic horror. Basically, what we today would see as splatterpunk or extreme horror. In the closing paragraphs of the story, Poe writes,
"There came a light tap at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound. And then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human fingernails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open. And in my tremor, it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces, and from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor.
While Thomas White did publish the story, he worried what the reaction might be and questioned Poe about why he had to write such terrible stories, which, horror writers out there, how many of you have, if you're a horror writer, somebody has asked you that question at one point or other in your life. Poe responded,
"A word or two in relation to Berenice. Your opinion of it is very just. The subject is by far too horrible. And I confess that I hesitated in sending it to you. But the history of all magazines show plainly that those which have attained celebrity were indebted for it to articles similar in at to Berenice, in the ludicrous, heightened into the grotesque, the fearful, colored into the horrible, the witty, exaggerated into the burlesque, the singular wrought out into the strange and mystical. You may say all this is bad taste. I have my doubts. But whether or not bad taste is little to the purpose. To be appreciated, you must be read. And these things are invariably sought after with avidity. To be sure, originality is an essential in these things. Great attention must be paid to style, and much labor spent in their composition, or they will denigrate into the turrid or the absurd."
Poe's friend Kennedy then recommended to Thomas White that he hire Edgar as an editor, and White offered him a position at the publication in Richmond, Virginia.
It was an extremely difficult decision for Edgar, for he'd finally found a true family in Baltimore, with Aunt Maria and Cousin Virginia, and was loath to leave them. Aunt Maria had become the mother he'd always sought, and, kind of disturbingly, Poe was beginning to feel romantic notions to his teenage cousin, who was just coming into womanhood.
And taking the job would mean moving back to the city where he'd grown up, and living there as a meager assistant editor, a pauper with no inheritance. The class-conscious aristocrats, the battling planters and merchants, would both scorn him. But in the end, he decided to accept the offer, writing,
"You asked me if I would be willing to come to Richmond if you should have occasion for my services during the coming winter. I reply that nothing would give me greater pleasure. Indeed, I am anxious to settle myself in that city."
Though he'd lose yet another family, anything had to be better than slaving at a hot kiln as a brick manufacturer in Baltimore and slowly starving to death.
Chapter 4: The Southern Messenger.
Edgar was hired as a staff writer, literary critic, and editorial assistant for the Southern Literary Messenger, writing copy and proofreading, in charge of accepting and declining submissions, and received $15 a week, moving into a boarding house on Bank Street.
His literary uniqueness and incredible imagination were immediately evident, as he is said to have created modern science fiction when he wrote a hoax story, a story that was fiction and wildly fantastical, but published as nonfiction, called Hans Befall, about a balloon trip to the moon.
This story would be a huge inspiration on many early science fiction writers, like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. Jules Verne acknowledging him as the creator of the scientific novel, calling him le créateur de romans merveilleux scientifiques.
Très bien! While creating the science fiction story, Poe was also developing reasons of deduction that would eventually lead to the first detective story as well. Poe called this science of deduction ratiocination, a method of rationally examining clues without any preconceived prejudices.
In December of 1835, a mechanical marvel dubbed the greatest and most baffling wonder of this or any age appeared at a Richmond exhibition hall. It was the chess player of Malzel, a robot chess player. Yes, a robot chess player.
I love this. I love this whole thing here. It was variously either called the Turk or the automatron chess player. And this thing, it's like Zoltar, the fortune-telling robot in that movie Big. You know, it's like a mannequin in Turkish robes with a turban sitting before a chessboard on a big cabinet full of mechanical gears and cylinders.
It would nod and move its head as it picked up pieces and moved them. If the player made a bad move, it would even roll its eyes. The automaton chess player had traveled the world, even played Napoleon Bonaparte and beaten Benjamin Franklin in Paris.
As Poe would write about it, perhaps no exhibition of the kind has ever elicited so general attention as the chess player of Malzel. Whenever seen, it has been an object of intense curiosity to all persons. Yet the question of its modus operandi is still undetermined. Unlike the calculating machine of Mr. Babbage, an analytical engine which is nothing more than a mathematical machine, the Turk is able to apprehend and counter the chess moves of a human opponent, a far more complicated and subtle process. If the device is truly pure machine, we must be prepared to admit that it is beyond all comparison the most wonderful of the inventions of mankind. But we object to it as a mere theory assumed in the first place and to which circumstances are afterwards made to adapt themselves.
What he was saying, in his Poe way, was that he was determined to clear his mind of any preconceived notions of how it may work, and base his investigation purely on the clues he deducted by seeing them with his own two eyes, which is how his later master detective, Auguste Dupin, would set to solve crimes.
Remember, this is long before Sherlock Holmes, who writer Arthur Conan Doyle admittedly says was inspired by Poe's detective stories.
In the article, Edgar details how Maelzel exhibits the curiosity to the audience, opening the doors at the front and back of the cabinet to reveal it's full of machinery. He also focuses on the manner in which the gloved hand of the automaton grasps the chess piece from above, and states how at times the mechanical wonder fails to grasp the chess piece, and the empty hand moves to the intended position as if the piece were still clasped in its fingers.
Poe sees all of this, as well as the constant whirring noises, as intentional methods of creating an illusion, used, quote, with a view of exciting the spectators, a false idea of the pure mechanism in the automaton.
He notes how others have claimed a dwarf or child could be concealed in the cabinet, but brushes this off as absurd, before noting that the machinery was most likely just cleverly designed clockwork panels, creating the illusion of a cabinet crammed with complicated machinery. And a full-grown man could, in fact, easily fit in the cabinet, which was purposely built to appear much smaller than it actually was.
Then he noted how a man named Schlumberger, who toured with the mechanical wonder, was always mysteriously absent when the performance began. And once, when Schlumberger fell ill, the exhibition was canceled.
But Poe stops at making any judgment, instead letting the readers follow the logical path of observations and concur what they will from the clues.
I wonder whatever happened to this thing, man. I would love to have seen it.
Yeah, that's wild.
And while all of this may seem silly today, the article about the chess-playing automaton Poe wrote highlights both the burgeoning industrial age and the age of reason, which we take for granted. This is only a few decades after Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason shocked the world, and decades before Nietzsche would propose humanity's need for a god was dead, showing Poe not only to be a man of the times, but a person forming those very times as well, seeing logic as the main means of understanding the world and solving its many mysteries.
Chapter 5. Familial Desperation.
On July 7th, Edgar's grandmother, the general's wife, died at 79, meaning the loss of her annual pension, which his Aunt Maria, who became her mother's devoted nurse and servant, relied on. Now, his beloved Aunt Maria and cousin Virginia would be bereft of income.
Another relative, Baltimore lawyer and newspaper editor Nielsen Poe, then offered to take Virginia into his home and see to her welfare and education.
This whole thing just seems weird to me, but Poe, evidently fearing he'd lose his newest surrogate mother, as well as his cousin, whom he saw as a symbol of purity and divine femininity, a poet's muse and idolized soulmate, just plain freaked the fuck out when he heard the news, writing, "My dearest auntie, I am blinded with tears while writing this letter. I have no wish to live another hour. Amid sorrow and the deepest anxiety, your letter reached me, and you well know how little I am able to bear up under the pressure of grief. My only hold on life is cruelly torn away. I have no desire to live and will not. I love Virginia. passionately, devotedly. I cannot express in words the fervent devotion I feel towards my little, dear cousin, my own darling.
Just to reiterate, to be perfectly blunt and clear, Edgar Poe is talking about his 13-year-old first cousin, his father's sister, Aunt Maria's daughter.
I cannot speak as regards your peace, your happiness. You have both tender hearts, and you will always have the recollection that my agony is more than I can bear. I have no one now to fly to. I am among strangers, and my wretchedness is more than I can bear. What have I to live for?
Just a little dramatic. Just a little. Then he leaves a note for his teenage cousin Virginia, which is a doozy. Get ready for this.
My love, my own sweetest sissy, my darling little wifey, think well before you break the heart of your cousin Eddie.
And as Poe sat there in Richmond, awaiting news from Baltimore, the anxiety and stress of potentially losing yet another surrogate family welling up inside of him, he fell to that old family curse and began to drink, to quaff that kind nepenthe, hanging out in taverns with the local drunkards. He began to behave irrationally, showing up drunk to work. Then he just took off, bolted back to Baltimore to declare his love for his 13-year-old cousin in person.
And his auntie? Well, she approved, and a marriage license was taken out on September 22nd, and a secret ceremony performed, betrothing Edgar to his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia.
Edgar then wrote a letter to his boss, apologizing for his drinking and having fled Richmond unannounced, asking if he could return to his job.
And White wrote back telling Edgar, yes, he could have his job back, but just under one condition, if he promised to quit drinking, saying,
"You have fine talents, Edgar, and you ought to have them respected as well as yourself. Learn to respect yourself, and you will very soon find that you are respected. Separate from the bottle and bottle companions forever. If you should come to Richmond again, and again should be an assistant in my office, it must be expressly understood by us that all engagements on my parts would be dissolved the moment you get drunk. No man is safe who drinks before breakfast. I am your true friend, Thomas Willis White."
And this is very true. No man is safe who drinks before breakfast. While preachy and demanding, this letter does show how much faith White had in Edgar, how much talent he thought he had. Because, come on, someone starts showing up wasted, and then they just run off, and you're willing to hire them back?
So Edgar returned to Richmond on October 3rd, bringing Maria and Virginia along with him. Only Virginia was now his wife, whom he called his beloved sissy, as if he was more in search of a sister than a spouse. And Maria was no longer auntie, she was now his muddy, or mommy.
And Edgar quickly set to impressing his boss, making up for his shortfalling, taking up his duties with gusto, and became renowned around the country as a literary critic.
Chapter 6. The Tomahawk Man.
At that time, literary critics in the United States were in the habit of what was called puffing, or log rolling, writing these puff pieces that lavishly praised the works of other writers in hopes that those writers would praise them. Edgar thought this was seriously hindering American literature by not holding it to the highest standards. So he decided to become a very tough literary critic, becoming known as the Tomahawk Man, because he'd be so scathing in his reviews as to scalp the other writer.
Poe reviewed novels, poetry, biographies, nonfiction works about naval history, phrenology, botany, philosophy, religion, navigation, geography, natural history, music, and exploration, stating,
"In criticism, I will be bold and sternly absolute, just with friend and foe. From this purpose, nothing shall turn me. I shall aim at originality in the body of the work more than any other especial quality."
He became one of the most well-known critics in America, and his reviews sold a lot of magazines. But they also garnered him a growing list of enemies. No one was safe, even some of the country's most well-loved literary figures, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whom he'd accuse of both plagiarism and bad grammar, calling him, quote, "a dexterous adapter of the ideas of other people." Talk about a burn.
Yeah, right? As Poe would famously say, the pen is mightier than the sword.
But the test of time seems to have proven Poe mostly correct in his assessments. The writers he panned have mostly faded into obscurity, while those he championed and praised, like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Charles Dickens, are still studied and read today.
On Monday, May 16th, 1836, Poe formally married his cousin Virginia in his boarding house by a Presbyterian minister, her age falsely being recorded as 21. His boss, Thomas White, attended the wedding, and gave the new husband a raise in salary.
Poe's former fiancée, Elmira, still living in Richmond with her husband, saw Poe and his new bride together, and says the feelings that arose upon seeing the couple were agonizing. But she then remembered she was a married woman and banished those thoughts of jealousy as she would a poisonous reptile.
Edgar devoted a large portion of his salary to Virginia's education, including languages, literature, mathematics, and music, buying her a piano to practice on, and tutoring her himself in algebra.
Poe also dipped his toe in true crime. Of course he did. And we'll see more of this to come. At the time, true crime was relegated to newspapers and sleazy little penny dreadfuls. But Poe wished to elevate true crime into literature and art, and began working on a play based on the murder of Kentucky Attorney General Solomon P. Sharp.
Known as the Kentucky Tragedy, or the Beauchamp-Sharp murder, the infamous crime occurred in 1825, when a young woman named Anne Cook was seduced by Kentucky Attorney General Solomon Sharp, who then abandoned the girl when she became pregnant. After giving birth to Sharp's child, Anne found another lover, Jeroboam O. Beauchamp, and promised him she would marry him if he'd avenge her honor. So Beauchamp challenged Sharp to a duel, but Sharp refused. So Beauchamp, wearing a mask, snuck up on him one night and stabbed him to death.
After a sensational trial, Beauchamp was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. On the night before his execution, he was visited in his cell by Anne. The two attempted suicide by downing a bottle of laudanum and slitting their wrists. Anne died, but Beauchamp survived, only to be hanged the next day.
What a fucking story. That is a crazy story right there.
Yeah, oh God. Poe wrote the story as a blank verse play set in Italy for some reason, calling it Politian, and published excerpts in the Southern Literary Messenger. But they were not a success, and his friend Kennedy politely urged him to move on to other endeavors. But crime, both true and fictional, would be a subject Poe would often return to.
The Southern Literary Messenger was doing far better than it had ever done before, increasing sevenfold and bringing in a profit of over $10,000. But despite this, things were rocky between Edgar and his boss.
Poe became increasingly disgruntled that he wasn't being appreciated or compensated for all his hard work, and began to drink again, telling friends,
"My best energies were wasted in the service of an illiterate and vulgar, although well-meaning man, who has neither the capacity to appreciate my labors nor the will to reward them."
And White was not happy either, as Poe's scathing reviews began to bring more and more enemies, and his tales of horror were drawing cries of condemnation. All of this exacerbated by White's wife dying of uterine cancer.
Soon Poe's dark stories, forays into grisly true crime, and scathing reviews were just growing too much for White to handle. And he wrote to a friend,
"As highly as I really think of Mr. Poe's talents, I shall be forced to give him notice, in a week or so, at farthest, that I can no longer recognize him as editor of my Messenger. I am as sick of his writings as I am of him."
White tried to make the split amicable, giving Edgar a stipend and promising to publish chapters of the novel he was working on, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. But still, Poe was not pleased.
As Edgar would later recall of the time,
"The situation was disagreeable to me in every respect. The drudgery was excessive. The salary was contemptible. In fact, I soon found that whatever reputation I might personally gain, this reputation would be all. I stood no chance of bettering my pecuniary condition." I don't even know what pecuniary means. Does that mean like money?
Pecuniary.
pecuniary. Is that how you said it?
Yeah, I just don't know what it means.
Yeah, it says of or relating to money.
Yep, money, okay.
I don't know how to pronounce that word, so I learned something new today. Chapter 7, On the Road Again.
Quand je vous aimerai, ma foi, je ne sais pas, peut-être jamais, peut-être.
So, Edgar Allan Poe left Richmond and was again on the road, a wandering, restless spirit, this time dragging along his newest mother, his Muddy, and his cousin and teenage bride, whom he called Sissy.
In many ways, he's constructed a family, a mother and a sister for himself. And they moved into a small house on 6th Avenue in Waverly Place with a lodger named William Goins, a bookseller renowned for having the rarest editions and most esoteric of tomes. And they all lived together. Poe had finally finished his novel and was looking for a publisher. And by all accounts, he was sober and hardworking. As the lodger, William Goins, would say,
For 8 months or more, one house contained us, one table fed us. During that time, I saw much of him and had an opportunity of conversing with him often. And I must say, I never saw him the least affected with liquor, nor even descend to any known vice, while he was one of the most courteous, gentlemanly, and intelligent companions I have met with during my journeying and halting through divers divisions of the globe.
And in May, Harper and Brothers agreed to publish Poe's novel. Yay! And the full title was, now get ready for this title. This is some fucking title, dude, right here, right? Okay, here we go. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, comprising the details of a mutiny and atrocious butchery on board the American brig Grumpus on her way to the South Seas in the month of June 1827, with an account of the recapture of the vessel by the survivors, their shipwreck and subsequent horrible sufferings from famine, their deliverance by means of the British schooner Jane Guy, the brief cruise of this latter vessel in the Antarctic Ocean, her capture, and the massacre of her crew among a group of islands in the 84th parallel of southern latitude, together with the incredible adventures and discoveries still farther south, to which that distressing calamity gave rise.
Holy Shit. Wow. Okay. But New York was going through an economic depression, times were hard, and forever wandering. In 1838, the family moved again, this time to Philadelphia, finding a boarding house on Mulberry Street.
And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street. There should be a gothic horror Edgar Poe version of that Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, there should. But conditions in Philadelphia were no better than those in New York. Writer James Petter lived near the Poes and recalls them on the brink of starvation and surviving on bread and molasses for weeks at a time.
In July of 1838, Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and I'm not going to read the rest, was released, but sadly received mostly confused and negative reviews and failed to sell.
It didn't help at all that Poe had made so many enemies during his time as a literary critic. Lewis Gaylord Clark, whom Poe had fallen into a feud with, reviewed it for the Knickerbocker, where he said the book was, quote, told in a loose and slipshod style, seldom checkered by any of the more common graces of composition, with all its defects, not the least of which is that it is too liberally stuffed with horrid circumstances of blood and battle.
It did get some positive reviews. The Morning Courier saying, quote, the volume is highly interesting, well written, and to lovers of marvelous fiction will be quite a treasure.
But the book was ultimately a failure, even Poe himself saying it was a mess. To Poe, a novelist was a failed short story writer, and a short story writer was a failed poet. He strongly believed in brevity and thought the best written words could be read in one sitting.
Family then moved to a small house on 16th Street near Locust in early September. And as the autumn air grew chill and leaves began to turn, and that wonderful spooky season we all loved so much began, a great period of productivity swept over him, and he wrote some of his greatest works, beginning with the short story Ligeia, which was published in the Baltimore magazine, The American Museum.
Ligeia is the story of a haunted widower, perhaps in a haze of opium and alcohol, grappling with the death of his second wife, a cherubic and blonde-haired woman named Lady Rowena Trevanion. Deep in mourning, gazing on the corpse, he begins to see his first wife, a black-haired poet of great learning named Ligeia, rejuvenating herself in the corpse of Rowena. The tale appears to hopefully convey that human will can be stronger than death, but says so in such a dark and gothic manner as to be utterly morbid to the point of nihilism. Both of these incredibly beautiful women, archetypes for Poe perhaps, the raven-haired poet and the golden-haired maiden, both dead and gone. Poe ends the story saying,
The greater part of the fearful night had worn away, and she who had been dead once again stirred. And now, more vigorously than hitherto, although arousing from a dissolution more appalling in its utter hopelessness than any I had long ceased to struggle or to move, and remained sitting rigidly upon the ottoman, a helpless prey to a world of violent emotions, of which extreme awe was perhaps the least terrible, the least consuming. The corpse, I repeat, stirred, and now more vigorously than before, the hues of life lashed up with unwanted energy into the countenance. The limbs relaxed, and save that the eyelids were yet pressed heavily together, and that the bandages and draperies of the grave still imparted their charnel character to the figure, I might have dreamed that Rowena had indeed shaken off utterly the fetters of death. But if this idea was not, even then, altogether adopted, I could at least doubt no longer, when arising from the bed, tottering with feeble steps, with closed eyes and with the manner of one bewildered in a dream, the thing that was enshrouded advanced boldly and palpably, to the middle of the apartment. I trembled not, I stirred not, for a crowd of unutterable fancies connected with the air. The stature, the demeanor of the figure rushing hurriedly through my brain had paralyzed, had chilled me into stone. I stirred not, but gazed upon the apparition. There was a mad disorder in my thoughts, a tumult unappeasable. Could it indeed be the living Rowena who confronted me? Could it indeed be Rowena at all? The fair-haired, the blue-eyed Lady Rowena Trevanion of Tremaine? Why should I doubt it? The bandage lay heavily about the mouth. But then might it not be the mouth of the breathing Lady of Tremaine? And the cheeks, there were the roses as in her noon of life. And yet these might indeed be the fair cheeks of the living Lady of Tremaine, and the chin with its dimples as in health, might it not be hers? But had she then grown taller since her malady? What inexpressible madness seized me with that thought? One bound, and I had reached her feet. Shrinking from my touch, she let fall from her head, unloosened, the ghastly crements which had confined it, and there streamed forth into the rushing atmosphere of the chamber huge masses of long and disheveled hair. It was blacker than the raven wings of the midnight. And now slowly opened the eyes of the figure which stood before me. Here then, at least, I shrieked aloud, can I never be mistaken? These are the fool in the black and the wild eyes of my lost love, of the lady Ligeia.
Well done. Love it. The acclaimed Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw would say about the piece 70 years later.
The story of the Lady of Ligeia is not merely one of the wonders of literature. It is unparalleled and unapproached.
By Halloween of the next year, he'd have published the masterpiece, The Fall of the House of Usher, which contained within it the poem The Haunted Palace.
Evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloamed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within the valley, through the red litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid ghostly river through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh, but smile no more. You know, one thing that's interesting is a lot of his poems, in order to rhyme, they have to be said with a Southern accent, which shows that he really was a child of Virginia.
That's so interesting. While the dreamlike story is mired in symbolism about falling aristocracy, dark family secrets, hints of incest, and premature burial, the Gothic classic was inspired by a true story.
This is crazy. The Hezekiah Usher House, which was located on the Usher estate that is now a 3-block area in downtown modern Boston, Massachusetts. This house was constructed in 1684 and torn down in 1830. And rumors abounded that the young wife of the owner was having an illicit affair with a sailor. And when they were caught red-handed in the throes of passion, the husband entombed them both right there in the hidden room they were making love in. And sure as shit, when the house of Usher was torn down in 1830, 2 bodies were found embraced in a cavity in the cellar.
But the story Poe masterfully weaved was so surreal and poetic in nature, it led readers to wonder whether it was the house which crumbled or the sanity of the narrator. As he writes at the end,
"From that mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath, as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued. For the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure of which I have before spoken, as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher.
This entombment of a spouse by a jealous husband would also become the narrative of another piece he wrote in Philadelphia, The Black Cat.
And hiding body parts was also a theme of The Telltale Heart.
And the theme of contagion and death by disease and the separation of the classes, the elitism, formed the story The Mask of the Red Death.
And perhaps all this feeling tortured with no way out, going from one horror to another, inspired The Pit and the Pendulum.
All of these stories would be written there in Philadelphia in the ensuing years. Masterpiece after masterpiece of Gothic horror.
Washington Irving was so impressed by the fall of the House of Usher that he wrote Poe telling him he should publish a collection of these horror stories. So Poe gathered 25 of them and titled them Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, and they were published by Liam Blanchard of Philadelphia in December of 1839.
Unfortunately, the book, like his novel, was a failure, most likely because all of the stories had been previously published in various magazines and read before.
And in May of 1839, Edgar was hired as an assistant editor for Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, published by William Evans Burton, a popular character actor who often played a clown or jester on stage.
But Poe wasn't given much leeway with the magazine like he'd been with the Southern Literary Messenger, which he'd basically taken over during his time as editor. Burton did not want Poe writing harsh criticisms of other writers and making enemies, and he didn't want disturbing tales of horror that would shock readers.
He also didn't pay very well, only $10 a week, half of what Poe had been making in Richmond with the Southern Messenger. But Burton told Poe he'd only be working about 2 hours a day, just proofreading, editing, and writing a little copy.
Novelist Matthew Pearl describes Poe at this time, saying, "He could be charming, courtly, witty, and gracious, but he could also be sensitive, petty, suspicious, jealous, and resentful. He wanted to be noticed and appreciated, but he had a difficult time with processing appreciation."
And to assuage his meager salary editing for Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, Edgar then began contributing articles to the family newspaper, Alexander's Weekly Messenger.
Poe had always had an interest in secret writing, cryptograms, and ciphers, perhaps sprung from deciphering ancient Greek as a child in London, then sparked again during his time in the military, when messages were written in a coded form. So he challenged readers at Alexander's Weekly to send him puzzles, codes, ciphers, and cryptograms to decipher.
He was amazingly good at it, solving nearly all of them, then printing the code and the answer in the paper. And this feature was hugely popular, a precursor to Puzzle Master Will Shortz's Sunday Puzzle on NPR's Weekend Edition, which I'm a huge fan of. Do you like that? You listen to that?
I have never listened to that. Now I'm intrigued. Should I listen to the Sunday?
Yeah, man.
All right, I'll
Listen to
check it
Weekend
out.
Edition on Sundays. He gives these like, first he gives one that you write down and then you send the answers in, and then he takes all the people who got the answers right and then quizzes the one on air with like a.
Oh, wild! That sounds
It's
fun.
I kind of would like want to be on it, but then I don't know if I could take it. Some
Yeah,
of
that
them are
sounds
like
stressful,
a lot,
fun and stressful.
and you're like the whole world's listening. And some of them are real easy. You'll be like, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. And then some of them are so fucking hard. You're like, duh, and you just look stupid. But anyway, where was Edgar Allan Poe when we needed him with the Zodiac Killer?
Yeah, tell me about it. That would have been, there you go. That's like we were talking about the pale blue eye earlier and fictionalized Poe, stories. That's your story right there. Mashup of Poe solving the Zodiac killer. That would be wild.
Oh my God, that would be so good. Some killer, because Jack the Ripper would send letters into the editor, so it wouldn't be that to newspaper editors. Wouldn't
Okay,
be
there
that
you
far.
go. I already did my Poe fictionalized novel. This one's all you, Matt.
All right, I'm on it.
The puzzle feature became so popular that the paper was over inundated with challenges, just flooded, to the point they had to print a request for readers to stop sending in puzzles.
And we will see Poe's love of cryptography appear again in a few years when he writes his most popular story ever, The Gold Bug, which had ripples in the cryptography world up through World War II and even today.
With the extra income from his incredibly popular puzzle feature in Alexander's Weekly Messenger, Poe's little family was no longer surviving off of molasses and bread. Muddy and Sissy had a garden and grew fresh vegetables, and they got themselves a black cat. Poe writing an article about it, saying,
The writer of this article is the owner of one of the most remarkable black cats in the world, and that is saying much. For it will be remembered that all black cats are witches. The one in question has not a white hair about her and is demure and sanctified demeanor.
But trouble was afoot. There were many rumors that Burton was getting tired of running his gentleman's magazine and was going to sell it. Poe, who felt he was badly underpaid, began to make plans to start his own monthly magazine, a literary journal called The Pen, going so far as to even advertise the periodical in a search for early subscribers.
Burton, who thought Poe starting his own magazine would greatly reduce the value and price of his own, was furious and fired him. So Edgar called him a bully, a blackguard. That's one you don't hear anymore, blackguard. And an ass.
Burton called him a drunkard, which may have been true. There were rumors of Poe getting utterly shit-faced in Philadelphia, even being found passed out in the gutter.
It's when he did write his best work, though. Kind of like Stephen King and cocaine.
Yeah, right?
But undaunted, old Edgar set out to find backers and subscribers for his venture, setting a launch date of March 1841. But in February, a financial crisis hit the Philadelphia banks, crushing Poe's dreams of having his own literary magazine.
And yet he continued to write, masterpiece after masterpiece, sadly going unnoticed. And now the notion of ratiocination, of logical deduction that we saw with his investigation of Maelzel's animatronic chess player.
Poe envisioned a super sleuth, a masterful detective, solving a murder mystery which baffles the police, creating an entire new genre of fiction. And that story would be called The Murders of the Rue Morgue. And this would eventually lead him into the realm of true crime when he moved back to New York City yet again, and the real-life murder of a beautiful girl whom Poe knew, who worked in a cigar store down the street, became a sensation in the newspapers.
Her name was Mary Jones, and she was a bit of a local celebrity, a 20-year-old girl of uncanny beauty who was found floating in the Hudson River, strangled to death after being gang raped.
But to hear about that and how Poe used this horrendous and shocking murder as the basis of his detective stories, you're going to have to tune in next week for part 3 of the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you are enjoying our series.
And buy Christa's novel, Beneath the Poet's House. It's out now.
And harass Matt into writing the next Poe novel, Poe-inspired novel.
There you go. See you next week. You want to drop us a line, contact us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com, murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week with more of our tales of Edgar Allan Poe.